And before I call Brother Russ, I will ask everybody to silent the phone or to switch it off so that we can put our attention to Brother Russ. Brother Russ, you are welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good to see everyone's faces. The title of my talk is The Rest of the Story, and some of you oldsters out here who are of a certain age, which probably includes very few, know that there was a radio announcer in the Chicago area named Paul Harvey. And he would do news at first, but toward the end of his career, he had a radio show that essentially said, the rest of the story. So he would talk about a certain event that happened, and then he would tell you the behind the scenes type of thing that took place. And it was always kind of interesting because you never really realized there was things going on that made things either very easy for them or difficult. So anyway, I was going to also thank Brother Nick for his talk last week, because he was talking about in John 4, the previous chapter, about the woman at the well and the living water that came from that well. And so when we get to chapter 5 here that was just read by Brother Glenn, we see that there's another discussion about water. So not only is it for thirst, but it also is very helpful for healing. So I wanted to bring this out. This is a picture, or an artist's rendition, I should say, of Bethesda. And as you see here, there's it's called 5 Porches. And you can see these colonnades here. They're Greek colonnades. And it was described as 5 porches. And we'll get into it later. There were a lot of people that said, oh, that never existed, because the Romans did destroy it. So in AD 70, so this is the artist's rendition. And there was some issues surrounding as to whether it existed or not. But anyway, the upper portion of that pool is where apparently the water went up to, and then it went down into this area, and this is where the man was that was being spoken about in John 5 that was just read. So it's, I'll just tell you, I read through this story a lot of times, and I just thought there was a lot of strange discussion and talks in it. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, the whole episode made sense, but it seems there was more behind it. So it looks like this is not going to work for me now. So here we have actually a picture of the Hezekiah's tunnel. So now we're going to go back into the Old Testament under Hezekiah and see that he did bring water up to the city. And I think, so he brought water up to the city, and I think Brother Mark was telling me how he went into the tunnel. It was pretty dark. And yeah, he's giving me the thumbs up. So, in fact, that's where the origin of this water in the New Testament actually kind of comes from, this tunnel that was there. And so it brought water up, and I believe that one of the reasons Hezekiah in the Old Testament decided to build this tunnel was because I think he believed, Isaiah, that they were going to be attacked at some point in time by the Assyrians, by the Rabshakeh. We know that story. So he built this to keep water in their area, and also to keep the water away from the Syrians. So I think that's kind of interesting that he did that. Now, this pool that I showed previous, I don't know if I can go back to it here, but can't. But the pool was not built at that time, so I don't know. I'm sure Hezekiah had some type of reservoir for that. Well, we know too that he did build this pool because it essentially comes from 2 Chronicles 32 in the Old Testament, that's how he fortified the city, by bringing the water in. And so we see that structure of the tunnel that he brought in. So we ask ourselves then, what does this place mean? Bethesda. What does it mean in Hebrew? Well, we know that Beth means house, and there's the word Chesed. Apparently the C is silent. Hesed means mercy. And it goes on to say that, like many Hebrew words, it doesn't translate precisely into English. So the word means more than simply kindness. It often translates as loving kindness. And Hesed means giving oneself fully with love and compassion. So just think about that, giving one love fully with compassion. This is kind of what happens. And then think about, is the man really getting compassion when you see what he had been going through? So what are these 5 porches, or porticos that it's called and stated? Well, we saw the colonnades, so those were the porches that were there. And some mentioned to say the reason there were 5 was because it was related to the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses, and some say, probably equivalent to that, the Torah, which was also written by the Pharisees, that's what it meant to them. So interesting, we see that the pool, or the paralytic man, has been there for 38 years. Well, how many years were they in the wilderness? I think 40 usually comes up in our minds. But we do know that in Deuteronomy 2:14, Moses says, the time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was 38 years, until the entire generation, that is the men of war, had perished from the camp. So if this in fact is related somehow to the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, then you can see where this 38 years comes up in time of Moses. And we're talking about 38 years this particular individual has been having problems, which is a long time. I mean, I don't know how many of us are not 38 but at this time, but that's just the particular case here. Now again, that's the pool, and it was crowded with people. Now, I wanted to bring out in John 5:4, the King James Version talks about that there is someone stirring the water up. Other versions say the water was stirred up and don't mention anyone. But I think it's kind of interesting. The Diaglot translation, the Greek translation goes, a messenger for a season went down in the swimming bath and agitated the water. He then, first stepping in after the agitation of the water, sound became, who indeed was held by disease. So essentially, in so many words, it's saying a messenger, could have been an angel or whatever is what they described as happening, that came in and stirred up the water. The first person that got down there, that was the first person that was healed. Now we'll get into the architecture a little later on this too. So we know that there was this paralytic man. that Jesus has a conversation with. And so Jesus is essentially talking to someone who is completely helpless. He's paralytic, he can't move. He's alone, pretty much alone. But you say, is he really alone? He's in this big crowd of people that are there. They're waiting to get into the water. And he's waiting for somebody to get him down when the water gets disturbed by this messenger, whoever it might be, or an angel. So, and the other thing is, you need to get down there as fast as you can. So this particular thing, as we said earlier, has been going on for 38 years. So in a way you can see, is he 38 years in the wilderness? He seemingly is, and I don't know exactly if he was there every day. I kind of doubt it, because it sounds like it was a feast at the beginning of the chapter. So during these feasts, apparently that's what ended up happening. They would have this particular ceremony. So I think it does exemplify that they were wandering in the wilderness, that this man was, or all of these ill sheep that are there, all of these people that are there. And also, I just wanted to bring out, the sheep gate was mentioned early on, and that's where they brought the sheep in when they did the sacrifices. So this particular pool is just north of the temple. So it's in the city of Jerusalem, just north of the temple, and people are wanting to be healed there. So one of the things I want to take a look at is that we know that both Samaria and Judah had a tendency throughout their history of incorporating pagan religious practices into God's religion, into their religion, and they would legitimize these pagan practices. So I think it's interesting to take a look to see what's going on here. Now, I think one of the reasons that they may have done that was what Nick talked about last week, when we think about the pool, that is, because in Zechariah 13:1, Nick brought this up last week, in that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and uncleanness. So this, what Nick talked about in the previous chapter was about getting the word, the water that is better than what comes out of the well. And this is talking, in Zechariah, is talking about the water that heals sin and uncleanness. And we know sin gets mentioned here. So I think it's kind of powerful here that more than likely this was something that got incorporated into what they were at the feast at this time, what they were believing. I'm also thinking, in the next slide, Exodus 23, it says, you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water and will take sickness away from you. And again, because this is a Pentateuch, I can see where they can maybe say, yeah, well, this is the water here at Bethesda that's going to heal me. But I think there was a rest of the story behind these muddied the waters, in a sense, at this pool of Bethesda. Remember that I showed you earlier that the particular, actually we can go back, we can see the slide, but the slide had colonnades on it, Greek colonnades. So it had a Greek structure to it. And so this isn't just my idea, but I think many of the Jewish scholars incorporated the framework of the Greeks into the religion that they were doing at the festival. So they have a feast. We talked about that, was in the reading. They have a celebration. There's a congregation of a lot of sick people there, and something is stirring up the waters. Some entity, whether it's an angel or something, stirs it up, and the first one that gets in is the first one that gets healed. If you didn't, you missed your chance. Well, I don't have to go off on a side here, but it kind of reminds me of some of the faith healing that goes on today. It's like, somebody who is like a paralytic, they're not going to get him down to the water first, because more than likely he's not going to get healed. That's just what happens. So you take somebody who has an illness that you really can't tell is bad, and you bring them down first, and you say that they're healed. So I think what we're seeing here is Jesus is making a strong point. In a sense, Jesus is walking into a pagan area, and he's walking in undeterred. It doesn't matter to him. Jesus was the source of the living water in Samaria in the chapter 4 that was referenced by Nick last week. And now he's showing the source of healing water. And I think a lot of this was done to show his disciples what they were going to be needing to do in the future. So the reason I want to bring this up is historically, the culture context of the Pool of Bethesda. The Greeks had created a cult around Asclepius, the pagan god of healing. And during the Hellenistic period, the Greeks built healing centers, you remember the colonnades that we saw, all across the Greek Empire. The ill and disabled would congregate at these healing centers. They would drink and bathe in the waters of Asclepion and then sleep within the temple walls. They slept on mats laid out in a section of the inner sanctum temple called a baton, a place of divine dreams where Asclepius or his serpents would appear to give the sick clues about their healing. Now, I don't think they believed in Asclepius and the serpent, but I think they were able to say, well, some of this stuff we can probably go with, and we can just incorporate that, it was an angel that came down and did the waters, and then they were healed. But it's interesting to see that the Greeks had these built all over their empire. And the reason I bring that up is in Acts 9:29, it says, and it's talking about Paul, spoke boldly in the name of the Lord Jesus and disputed against the Grecians. Well, the Grecians were the names of, in the King James, of the Hellenists. So this is where Paul began to preach after his conversion. And I wonder and speculate if, we lost the signal here. I'm speculating if perhaps Paul didn't witness and see some of this that went on at Bethesda, and realized that Jesus would go in among the Hellenists and the Pharisees, apparently, that were there. So if you go later into Acts 11, verse 20, again, Paul's talking about Paul, and it says, some of them were men of Cyprus and Cyrene, which, when they came to Antioch, spake unto the Grecians, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned unto the Lord. And because of those conversions, Paul and Barnabas then went to Antioch. So I think Jesus is making this statement, as I said earlier, at least among the Hellenists that were probably there, and we know there were Pharisees in attendance because they attacked him later. So we have this kind of congregation of several different Jewish types. There may have been Sadducees there too also, I don't know. So he healed the paralytic, and we know that was a no-no because he carried his mat on the wrong day of the week, right? The Sabbath day. That was something you couldn't do. So then, I would ask myself, when the question that Jesus gave him is, do you want to be healed? And I would think the first thing that you would say is, yeah, I really do want to be healed. Of course, we know this paralytic didn't know that it was Jesus at the time. But remember what the answer was of the paralytic? He was essentially saying, well, I can't get down to the water fast enough. Somebody's not taking me down there, so, otherwise I would be healed. And I think that's, to me, kind of an interesting statement. And as it goes on, what does Jesus say? Well, he says, rise up, take your pallet, and walk. So he doesn't really even address the issue about, hey, I don't have anybody to get me down there. So in essence, we know that he is alone. Now, I wouldn't just speculating. I would say, if I really believed this, that the waters were going to get, heal me. Didn't you hear me, mister? I just essentially told you that I need somebody to get me down to the water. Maybe you and those with you can get me down there. But he didn't say that. He didn't say that at all. He did exactly what Jesus told him to do. But he didn't know the identity of Jesus. So I think Jesus is healing the paralytic right in front of this crowd of perhaps a lot of unbelievers, a lot of sick people, and they witnessed the healing. And I think also what he's saying to the man and others there is, why do you believe in a myth? And I think he said the same thing last week when he was talking to the Samaritan woman. Remember, well, we can't have true worship unless we go to the temple in Jerusalem. That's what we've been told by the Jews. But we worship out here where Jacob's well is, either Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. That's where we worship. And Jesus said, no, neither place is where you worship. That's not where true worship is going to be. So, in a sense, he debunks that myth also in John 4. And now I think he's doing the same thing in John 5. Now, these kind of waters, they're not going to heal you. So the first thing we see is the Jews ask the paralytic, and these I'm assuming are Pharisees, why are you breaking the law on the Sabbath? That's also very strange to me. It's like, you would think they would be saying, why am I not being, who healed you? And I know if it was me and some of the medical issues I'd have, it wouldn't be like, hey, I think you're carrying that on the wrong day of the week. It would be, who did that? Who helped you in that? But of course, that's not what the Pharisees are trying to say at all. And I think we can also see that throughout their history. They're essentially saying, don't be on the fence. I think Jesus is saying, don't be on the fence on this. Why are you on the fence? And we can go all the way back to Mount Carmel, remember, with the prophets of Baal. Don't be on the fence on any of this, because there's only one way to go. So we see that the paralytic did the right thing. He showed himself to the priest, and then he sees Jesus, and he finds out, hey, that's who it is. That's who healed me. And so what does Jesus say? Jesus tells him to sin no more, lest something worse befall you. I just looked at him, that's strange. Why would you, I've been 38 years, and you just told me something worse is going to befall me? What could be worse than 38 years of this? And I think that's a pretty good question. So I kind of think anyway, this was another slide that I wanted to show you that goes back to Isaiah chapter 2, where in Chuck's class we're talking about how they incorporated a lot of the pagan ideas into their religion when they were in Babylon. It said, for thou hast rejected thy people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of diviners from the east, soothsayers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with foreigners. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. So there's a history. I would just want to say there's a background that they've done this. And I think, you get into the New Testament, they say, well, we don't do that. And just to give an example here, I don't want to go too far off the side, but, when you go to, in the U.S., back in the old days when you went to college, you have to learn about Western civilization. You needed to know how, what your roots were, and they went back to Western civilization. So that was a big thing back in the late 60s and 70s. And I think in a sense, we get inundated with stuff like that, and we don't, we're too, it's too much in our face that we don't even recognize it. But I think what Jesus is saying, no, follow my word, do what my instruction, which the paralytic did. So I wanted to go on to say, I think I already had this one.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to say here, so in context, this wasn't just another miraculous healing. I think that's the way I read it for a long time. Wow, it's great, some miraculous healing. And it is that. But he wanted his Jewish Hellenistic audience to gain a new understanding as with his meeting with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus was making the claim that he was the source of healing. He was the source of living water. The living water was the previous chapter Nick brought out. Now he's saying, I am the source of healing. And so I kind of I wanted to bring this out. So it said, when Alexander the Great was attempting to conquer the world, he expected the places he conquered to adopt Greek culture. Many Jews were part of the lands he conquered, and many did indeed choose to adopt the language, customs, and Greek culture. Those Jews, or anyone who did, were called Hellenists or Grecians in the King James Version. Even though they weren't born Greek, they choose to live as Greeks. On the other hand, there were Jews who refused to become Hellenists. They chose to keep the Hebrew customs and the cultures, as did their forefathers. They spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and strictly followed the Torah. So you had these mix, I think, at this feast and temple. You had different people there. So, and then you think in the Old Testament with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they weren't Hebrew names, right? So you get into a place like Babylon, they're saying, we're going to change your culture because we're going to rename you to what we want. We're going to tell you what to believe. And that's what Alexander the Great did with the Greeks. And then you saw the Greek colonnades in Bethesda. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting point. So one of the things that I wanted to concentrate here, this slide was before. But so, what could be worse than 38 years of suffering? Well, I think it's the last part of this. Because until the entire generation, that is the men of war, had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. So he's saying to the paralytic man, the paralytic man is more than likely going to sin at some time in the future, but he's saying, rely on me. Don't rely on men. Don't rely on men to get you to the water, because that's not going to help you. So the kingdom, I think, is what he's telling him to focus on. That's worse than 38 years of being a paralytic, that you don't get in like these unbelievers that were at the time in the wilderness. And I think he uses that because, again, that was the five porches, the Pentateuch, the Old Testament. He's kind of relaying that point back that if you're an unbeliever, you're not going to come in. So that's worse than 38 years. So I think it's something to keep in mind. So what are the takeaways from me from this? I think it definitely happened at the pool of Bethesda. There was a time when people didn't believe that it even existed. But in the 19th century, they proved that it did. So they said, well, John was written by a zealot sometime later, so that was not true. Well, now we know it is true. It really happened. What do we know? Jesus cared about the sheep. It was the sheep gate. They came in. He was very, very caring about that. So much so that it was named, that he would have unwavering compassion, something that is difficult for us to translate. I think Jesus showed his disciples he was willing and able to stand up to the Jewish authorities to protect and instruct his sheep by going into a hostile and antagonistic environment. And he would go after one sheep to make sure that he could make it well and that he would have salvation. Just like the woman at the well in the previous chapter. Jesus debunked what was not believable. He took the pagan ideas and threw them out. And I also think that he saw the paralytic man, I think, who he saw was sitting on the fence. But he was able to convince him that he need not do that anymore, that he needed to take up his bed and walk. I also think the 38 years was going to become a distant memory to him, based on the joy that would become in the kingdom. And he was alone, and we can think of the 146th Psalm, the first verse, where it says, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, whose there's no help." That's what he was doing. I think also, like the two that were on the road to Emmaus with Cleopas, remember, Jesus didn't identify himself immediately. Remember, they were surprised to know that Jesus didn't know what happened in Jerusalem. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't know about the crucifixion. And Jesus says to them, "You're slow and foolish to believe the prophets, that the Messiah would suffer." But I don't think Jesus ever dwelt on the suffering. Yes, it's something that happens, but it's not something you dwell on. 1 Peter 5:10 says, "And after you have suffered a little while, the Lord of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you." 2 Corinthians 4:17, "For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for eternal weight, the eternal weight of glory, beyond all comparison." So I was just thinking, if any of you, like myself, have had a few major surgeries, you kind of forget about all of the detail that happened. Unless somebody brings it up, it kind of goes away. And I think this kind of explains to me, this actually was what I was going to get to about that not being believed until the 18th century, but now they know that it's in fact true. So I also wanted, before I ended up, just take a look. This is kind of the chiastic model. I think some brother brought it up before. There's a lot of passages. I think another brother told us, if you look in the Bible, they're kind of like all over the place, this balancing here. So if you look on the left where it says table 1, there was a feast of the Jews and there was a healing pool. B, there was a crowd of people of ill sheep. They were ill. An angel or someone stirs the waters and it gets healed. There's a sick sheep. We know that's the paralytic. Jesus sees him in the crowd. He pulls him out. Jesus asks him a question. Do you want to be healed? The sheep replies, "I don't have anyone to help me. I'm alone." Jesus answered, "Rise up." And the sheep is healed on the Sabbath day. So if you look at the mirror, the work's done on the Father's Sabbath day. Jesus does that work. B, the Jews persecute Jesus. So that's the crowd of ill sheep. Jesus made him well. This is the angel that they thought stirred up the water, but it's actually Jesus. The sheep is forgiven and warned, and I believe warned to follow his master. And we see that he, in fact, is a sick sheep. Jesus then slips into the crowd. In the reading, he's just gone. He vanishes, and we see Jesus sees him in the crowd. The Jews question the man. Remember, who did this? And, Jesus questions the man. And we get to for the final H, Jesus says it's not lawful, or they say it's not lawful. Jews say it's not lawful, and Jesus says, "Rise up, go ahead and do it." So it's kind of powerful there. And I thought in ending here, I would look at Hebrews chapter 12. So if you kind of think about this in context and then think of Hebrews chapter 12, beginning verse 2, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself. We saw that hostility that went against Jesus. So that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. And that's what he didn't want that sheep to grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation which addresses you as sons? My sons, do not disregard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor lose courage when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines him who he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives it. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom your father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participate, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time at their pleasure, but he, talking about the Lord, disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. And finally in verse 11, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And I think that's the message that we get from our Lord and Savior Jesus.